Well, let's get started. Laura says let's go. If you want to be late for the resurrection, I guess that's your business, right? We'll get started here. Oh Lord, bless the intention of my heart and the words of my mouth. Amen. Well, welcome to Adult Forum, the Lenten season. And the topic for this next 5 Sundays will be the resurrection of Jesus as we look forward to that great feast day of the church. If you take a look at the slide up there, this is Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in the lower left-hand corner is the Garden Tomb. Thousands and thousands of people every week visit Jerusalem and visit the place that is reputed to be where the resurrection took place. Now, is it the actual place? Nobody knows. And there's a lot of evidence that it's not the place, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But nevertheless, the message of 2,000 years of Christianity draws people from all over the world. And this topic, the resurrection of Jesus, of course, is really the corner of our faith. Now, recent scholarship of the last 100 years has splintered the resurrection into hundreds of interpretations. If you go to any library or bookstore, there's been a lot written about it, obviously, but especially in the last 100 years, as the studies of the quote-unquote historical Jesus have reached new heights. Scholars are trying to find out, well, what did it actually mean? What was it? What was the resurrection? What took place? And what's our meaning? Some historians say that we can know absolutely nothing about it, that it's an event so far removed and so unique that it sort of defies historical inspection. There's even some clergy within many denominations who now distance themselves from the traditional belief in Jesus' resurrection. This was one of the things I know when I first started to get into this subject, and as an adult and shaping my faith, I started to find out that there's people in Christian churches who deny the actual resurrection of Jesus, that it's got a metaphorical meaning, that it's about just rebirth and a change of life. And that always struck me as just strange, unusual. The resurrection to me, of course, is the cornerstone of our faith. So why should we study it? If historians are telling us we can know very little about it, if it's a mysterious event, what's the use? Why study it? Well, first of all, St. Paul says, of course, it's the foundation of our faith. If Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. And so this event, this resurrection of Jesus, it is the foundation of our faith, the very basis of it. Now, what a person also believes about the resurrection shapes their behavior. What you believe about the resurrection is going to shape your behavior. And it's going to shape your thoughts and just how you approach your life. You know, the idea that there's a life after this life, a full life, a life greater than this life, that's going to have an effect upon you as you live out the life in this world. Now, obviously, the resurrection and the attractiveness of the Christian faith to people is that it addresses a profound question about human existence, which is what happens to you when you die? What is going to happen to us? What is the nature of our existence, if there is an existence, after our death? And so that question alone should be an attractive one, should be almost an evangelical question that we present to the world. What's going to happen to you when you die? If it is true, it's good news for the world, isn't it? And everyone should know. And so if we study the resurrection and we find that there's significant meaning for us, not only as the church, of course, but individually, then this is something that we want to share with people, this belief that this isn't the end, that life continues, that God loves us and loves the world. Now, my hopes and prayers for you. This is a topic that, I have 3 ordained clergy sitting in front of me. And this topic is full of, a lot of different sort of tributaries, if you will, and a lot of different paths to go down. And I'm trying in 5 weeks here to give you a good sense of the resurrection and of all the sort of little different angles of it as we get into that final season, of course, the final week of before Easter, and so that you'll have a deep understanding. I want to increase your faith. Okay, as I've studied this, out of everything that's in the Bible, everything that's in the faith, this is the thing that increases my faith the most. When I study this topic, it just wells up inside of me. Now, I take that to be the Spirit of God, because I've looked at the resurrection and I've walked right up to unbelief, right up to the edge of that. But I've always been pulled back. And that welling up in me, I believe, is the Spirit of God. It's not wishful thinking, although, of course, to live forever is a pretty good wish. But I want to increase your faith. I want you to face your own mortality with confidence in the love of God. As Christians, if we just, sometimes it just comes down to simple belief. If we just believe God at His Word, right? This idea of facing the end of our lives, our own mortality, whatever the future is, we can face it with confidence because we know at the end of the day, the last word will not be death. Almighty God will have the last word about death. Now, I also want, over the next few weeks, hopefully to increase your knowledge in defense of the Christian faith. Your garden variety atheist will attack the Christian faith at this point, the resurrection. This is fertile ground for just a lot of unbelief and a lot of, Jesus was a great teacher and blah, 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 but the resurrection, well, that doesn't happen. Dead people don't rise up. And for the atheist or the agnostic, the unbeliever, this is where their chance at faith sort of breaks down. The next 5 weeks, I want you to increase your knowledge so that you can defend the Christian faith. The Christian faith is not something that, as a good lawyer, is not something you don't have a good case with. You're going to see this. You have a good case here for the resurrection. And so we'll increase your knowledge, hopefully, in the defense of the Christian faith. And then this ties in, of course, with the first one, just to know the power of Christ's resurrection. As you study it and you read about it, you think about it, you ponder it, there is that welling up inside of you that is going to happen. And that's the Spirit of God. And so those are my hopes and prayers for you as we go through the next 5 weeks. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge, and I want to just do this quickly, there's a lot written about the resurrection, and of course I'm vulturing a lot of material here, but there's one who stands out within this subject, and that's N.T. Wright, who's an Anglican New Testament scholar. He's probably, certainly in the top 2 or 3 scholars of the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, he is outstanding. And he has written a very definitive work on the resurrection, about 800 pages long. And a lot of what will be presented here today will be from N.T. Wright, Anglican scholar. And in fact, there's the book. You can get that on Amazon. It'll run you about $30, but it's fantastic. Covers the whole thing. So let's get started. 5 sessions, the next 5 Sundays. Hopefully you can make them all. The first one, today we're going to talk about life after death in the ancient pagan world. I want you to understand the context for when St. Paul starts talking about resurrection and when Jesus comes along and the resurrection happens. What's the historical context? What was going on? What was the typical pagan thinking about death and life after it? in that first century and even prior to that. So we'll look at that today. Next week, then, we're going to look at life after death in the Old Testament. The Old Testament has a lot to say about it. And you'll see in the New Testament, when St. Paul comes along, he links Jesus' resurrection to the creative power of God. A very Old Testament, of course, idea about Yahweh and his creative powers. So we'll look at that next week. The third week, we'll look at resurrection in the writings of Paul, in other New Testament writings, non-gospel New Testament writings, and also in the early church fathers and early Christianity. They had a lot to say about it, and it was a hotly debated issue. Session 4 then that'll be about 3 weeks before Easter, 4 weeks. It'll be the resurrection in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What do they say about the resurrection? How do they describe it? What are the difficulties with their narrative? We'll look at that. And then the last session, I think it's 2 weeks before Easter Sunday, we'll get into the meaning of the resurrection. We've looked at all this stuff, and then in the 5th session, we'll ask ourselves, what's the meaning of this? How should we live? What does this do for us, this knowledge of the resurrection and this understanding of it? Now, on your table there, I've got some cards, and I think 1 or 2 pens. As things pop into your mind, I want you to write those questions down on those index cards, and then just leave them at the end, leave them on the table, or I'll collect them. I want to address any questions you have. Anything that pops up at all about the resurrection. Any thoughts, write those down. You can attach your name to them, you can leave them anonymous, whatever you want to do. But I want to make sure to answer your questions as best I can that come up in your own mind. Now, as we get into this, I want to, for a few minutes here, I want to be a sort of re-put on my coat of history teacher. Because a lot of this, and this goes to the defense of the resurrection, a lot of defense of the resurrection has to do with, well, how do you take history? How do you interpret history? How do you study history? How do you take events of the past and how do you look at them? And I want to show you here 5 senses of history. So I want you to put on your hat as a history student. And I want you to sort of to think about these different senses of history. So when we're thinking about the resurrection, how does the resurrection fit into all of these different senses of history? Okay, so the first one, for example, is history as an event. If we say something is historical in this sense, it happened, whether we can prove it or not, right? So, for example, there was a day in past history when the last Tyrannosaurus Rex died, right? There was a day when that happened. Maybe it was in this neighborhood. I don't know. Who knows, right? We can't prove that it happened, but we know that it did. We know that that was an event. Nobody's described it. No human was around to write about it, but it happened. So that's history as event, right? Things happen whether we can prove them or not. Now, another sense of history is history as significant event. Not simply that an event took place, all right, something happened, but that it was significant enough that it had incredible consequences and somebody probably wrote about it or passed that on orally through oral tradition. So there's history as event, all kinds of things happen. And then there's history as significant event, something big, something momentous. Certainly the resurrection is going to fall into the second category. And you'll see it falls into a lot of these, but certainly that, arguably, it's the most significant event in history, right? when you think about it, whether you're an atheist or a believer or not. The resurrection, you better find out if that was true or not. That's a pretty significant thing. The third sense of history is history as a provable event. Now, in this sense of the word, something happened and we can demonstrate that it happened. Now, this is where you're going to get into a lot of argumentation, of course, with people. And in the history community, what's provable? What's provable? We can demonstrate that it happened. Now, in our world today, of course, I'll never forget in 1991, I was teaching history, and the first live war in the history of the planet was broadcast, right? I'm sitting there watching CNN. I remember it clearly. I was with a couple other coaches. I was teaching at West Middle School. We were down at Kelly's Sports Bar. We were drafting our teams. We had just had tryouts, and we were picking our teams. And we had the TV on. And it was 5 or 6 o'clock, and all of a sudden the bombing of Baghdad starts. Live on TV. Unbelievable. First time in the history of the world. So provable event. History is provable event. In that sense of the word, something has happened and we can demonstrate that it happened. And that's easier today than it ever has been. Now, when you talk about the resurrection as provable event, this is where you're going to get into debates. Because we have witnesses, right? We have witnesses. We have 4 witnesses, gospel witnesses, and others. And so history is provable event. Keep that in the back of your mind there. Now, there's also history as writing about the events of the past. Something was written about. It can include even oral history, even if it wasn't written about. The point is the story is retold, okay? It's retold. So 2 and 4 are very close together. Something was significant, and then, of course, you write about it. Or you give an oral history of it. Or some authors write as historical fiction, which is a popular genre of writing. So history as writing about the events of the past. Now again, certainly this is where the New Testament writings come into clear focus here, writing about the events of the past. Now, the last one, I put it on here, it's really a combination of 3 and 4. And this is the senses of history that have dominated the world scene since the Enlightenment, okay, in the last 300 or 400 years. Ever since the age of scientific reason, the idea of writing about history and what is history has taken shape as provable event, and it was written about. Provable event, and it was written about. And so our post-Enlightenment world, it's become very narrow in what it accepts, of course, as history. We are going back now to a time where the first 2, 1 and 2, are very important. Certainly number 2, when we talk about the resurrection, this is something that the writers had a hard time sort of wrapping their heads around and describing. Okay? So as we get into this, just keep in mind these different senses of history and try to place yourself into that first century Christian community where, okay, so something happened, we experienced it. Now, how do we tell everybody else about that? How do we explain that to everyone? So the senses of history, does this make sense? I wanted you to sort of understand the framework and how historians view history and different ways of approaching it. Well, let's get to our first topic here this week. Life after death in the ancient pagan world. Well, there was one superstar of the ancient world, and that was Homer. Homer, the writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I look at Homer, and I don't want to debate whether there was an actual one Homer, or there was 2 or multiple Homers, 3 or 4, because that debate is out there. But Homer was like the Shakespeare, Steven Spielberg, T.S. Eliot, all wrapped into one. I mean, this guy was the source of a lot of ancient culture and belief. He wrote two great works. The tradition is that Homer was blind, and that he actually memorized the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he would give performances of these two works. Now, if you've ever waded through the Iliad and the Odyssey, well, you're looking at thousands of pages there. And Homer, of course, apparently, according to tradition, he would recite these from memory. Now, in the Iliad, he writes, he puts this quote in the mouth of Achilles. Achilles is talking to King Priam, who has just had his son killed by Hector in the Trojan War. And Achilles says to King Priam, "You must endure and not be brokenhearted. Lamenting your son will do no good at all. You will be dead yourself before you bring him back to life." Not much hope there, according to Homer. There was no life after death. Aeschylus, the father of what we call tragedy. Aeschylus in the 5th century BC, so quite a few centuries before the life of Jesus. He says, "Once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection." Very blatant. No doubt. In fact, the word in Aeschylus there that he used is going to be the same word, anastasis, that's going to be used in the New Testament for resurrection. Aeschylus says, doesn't happen. And again, Aeschylus was a very popular writer and writer of tragedies in the ancient Greek world. Here's a well-known ancient epitaph, which on quite a few headstones. I wasn't. I was. I am not. I don't care. The finality of death there. You die, that's it. We're done. Pliny the Elder, great writer of Roman history. He dies, by the way, at the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Vesuvius erupts, it buries Pompeii. Most of you have probably seen some evidence or some show about that or books. Quite a thing. Pliny the Elder, though, said, "What is this crazy idea that life is renewed by death? Everyone knows such talk is nonsense." Are you seeing the pattern here in the ancient world?
So they just did not believe in life after death?
That's going to be the prevailing thought. Now, you're going to see there are some, as N.T. Wright says, there are some people who are swimming or going against the traffic who are going to say, no, there could be. But most of that, the evidence for that is going to be in myths. It's going to be in stories, and people knew they were stories. So nobody is really making any serious claim that there's going to be life after death. Ramsay MacMullen, who's a